So this webinar is a collaboration between OCASI's Immigrant and Refugee Communities, Neighbors, Families and Friends campaign and the Refugee Settlement Support Project. In a moment, Sidrah will tell you more about the IRC and FF campaign. And I'll tell you a little bit about our project. The Refugee Settlement Support Project is, we basically spoke with many frontline workers across Ontario to find out what gaps and challenges they experienced in the context of working with resettled refugees. So government assisted, but as well privately sponsored and blended visa office referred persons. Some of you may have participated in one of our focus groups, interviews or surveys, so thank you for sharing your experiences and perspectives with us. One of the things participants told us was that frontline. So no one can hear us? Okay, thank you. Thanks for the confirmations, everyone. Someone had written that they can't hear us or panicked, but yeah, we're good. Thank you. Yeah, so one of the things that we heard from participants was that frontline workers want more opportunities to share their experiences and to learn from each other. Sorry, and they also identified specific training topics. So one of them is this one for today's webinar: the how to respond when a client discloses domestic violence. So I think, without further ado, I can pass the mic on to Sidrah.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to Moving from Fear to Action, Building Frontline Workers' Capacity for Intervention on Domestic Violence. My name is Sidrah, and I'm the coordinator of the Immigrant and Refugee Communities, Neighbors, Friends, and Families campaign. I'm also a writer and a researcher who focuses on gender-based violence. And this is part 4 of a webinar series. And I just want to let everyone know that the recordings of these previous webinars will be emailed to everyone who's participating today. And it's very important to review this material because today's webinar is building on knowledge from the previous sessions. Very briefly, in part 1, we debunked dangerous myths about domestic violence and talked about the many forms of violence such as financial violence, stalking, and psychological abuse. In part 2, we covered the warning signs of domestic violence and the signs of high risk, according to the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee. And in part 3, we tackled the question, why doesn't she leave? And looked at the dangers and difficulty in leaving abusive relationships, as well as specific barriers that immigrant and refugee women may face. So in today's webinar, we're going to get into detail and handle a lot of your questions and scenarios about what exactly to do when we're handling a client's disclosure of abuse. So if a client comes to you and says she's living with abuse, what steps do you take? And to help us answer this question, we have with us a guest expert, Fatima Filippi, who's the Executive Director of Rexdale Women's Centers. And hello, Fatima, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And I will just share a bit of her bio. Fatima has worked in the immigrant and women's services sector since 1982. She joined Rexdale Women's Center in 1987 and was appointed Executive Director in 1989. Fatima is passionate about social justice and improving the lives of women. She has worked as an English as a second language instructor, English as a second language coordinator, settlement and women's abuse counselor. Fatima has worked with culturally diverse staff and boards of directors to implement settlement, orientation, English language, crisis intervention, violence against women and children, and services for youth and seniors. And finally, she has extensive experience working in networks, coalitions, and partnerships, which is very important for this kind of work. She has served on many boards of directors of local service organizations, as well as OCASI's board of directors for various terms. So welcome, Fatima. She is going to be she's going to help answer your questions in the second part of this webinar. For the first part of the webinar, I'm just going to go over a few slides that overview what best practices are in handling a client's disclosure of abuse. And Fatima, please chime in at any time to add, and I'll should let you speak and say hello.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sidrah. Thank you for allowing me to be here today. And I think my expertise really comes from my work with so many individuals across the field in the sector. So hoping to share what I've learned and what our organization has learned over the years with our colleagues and certainly with this partnership with OCASI.
So what are some best practices in handling a client's disclosure of abuse? What I want to start with is your first words to your client when abuse is disclosed. This may seem very simple, but the first words that you say can have an enormous impact. So one of the first things you want to say is, "I believe you." And you want to keep in mind that the abuser may have told her that no one will believe her. So you making this clear to her is a very important first step. You also want to say, "It's not your fault." Again, the abuser may have blamed her for the abuse, told her that it's happening because of her, or because of trauma, which we covered in previous webinars. She may be blaming herself, thinking that abuse is happening because of her, something to do with her. So you want to say, "It's not your fault." You also want to affirm that she's done a courageous thing by sharing with you and shown you a lot of trust. So you can say something and put this into your own words so it sounds natural, but thank her for trusting you. And you also may want to show compassion and say something like, "I'm sorry this is happening to you," or "You deserve better than this." And then finally, you want to ask, "How can I help?" Asking what she needs shows that you're willing to take direction from her, and that is the best way to offer support. When you ask how you can help, make sure to listen carefully to her answers, because you can get information about what gaps there might be in her life. She might not have access to a cell phone. She may not have access to a bank account. So asking how you can help can give you details about some of those practical measures. Okay.
Absolutely agreed. It is important that you validate her experience and that you build trust, and that she knows that you're there to help her regardless of how you feel but your role is to really work with the woman to identify what it is that she needs and what she thinks is going to help her with the situation.
So those are your first words. The next thing you want to make clear is that what she's told you will remain confidential. A lot of the time survivors can be worried about gossip or news of the fact that they're living with abuse spreading around. So you want to make it clear to her that it will remain private and confidential, and that will be respected. You also, though, want to let her know that there will be exceptions to confidentiality, and she should be aware of that. And the exceptions to confidentiality are that if violence occurs in your agency space, you cannot keep confidentiality about that. In that case, you have to follow your agency's protocols, which may look like calling the police, calling Children's Aid Society if children are involved, and filling out an incident report. There's also an exception to confidentiality if there's a reasonable grounds to suspect that children are being abused, neglected, or are witnessing domestic violence. If that is the case, there is a duty to report to child welfare authorities. If a client discusses plans to attempt suicide or harm another person, that's also a limit to confidentiality. If seniors or people with disabilities are being abused. And finally, if there's a court order to release information, which might happen if a person's mental health comes into question during legal proceedings. So it's important for the client to know that their privacy will be respected, and also what cases will come up where confidentiality might have to be broken.
Sometimes the client may not want to speak to a worker from the same cultural community because they fear a breach of confidentiality within the community. So really it is your job as understanding that kind of cultural competence that's required in addressing the woman's need. Not all women will feel that way, but certainly some will. They don't want this out in the community, and so therefore they fear maybe talking to someone from that community. And so you may need to look internally within your own organization or reassure her again, that confidentiality, regardless, will be maintained under the certain circumstances, aside from the exceptions.
Great. So a big piece after the disclosure is staying connected to her. Abuse thrives in isolation, and isolation and abuse go hand in hand. So you want to stay connected to the client who's disclosed to you. And a few tips we have for that are, number one is you want to find out what the safest way to communicate with her is. It's very important to be aware that emails, text messages, internet search histories, and phone calls could all be monitored by the abuser. So you want to ask her what the best way to communicate with her is and follow that. You also can stay connected to her by creating opportunities for her to come to your agency without the abuser, such as having women's focused programs. And Fatima has some great examples of this being very successful. You want to provide her access to interpreters if she needs them. Have regular conversations with her to build trust over time. Again, always listening to what she needs. And connect her to supportive services, but when you make those referrals, follow up about each referral. And I just want to answer the question of, what if while you're staying connected with her and she's disclosing, she doesn't want to call it abuse? That's okay. It's very difficult and frightening to accept that abuse is happening, and that can often take time. So without forcing labels of abuse on her, you can show her that you're concerned by saying things like, I'm afraid for your safety. I'm afraid for the safety of your children. There is help available for you and your family. And you don't deserve to be hurt or treated that way. So these are phrases you can use if she doesn't want to call it abuse.
Just another point. I think, with this age of internet and issues of accessing information online, we've known clients who've had security cameras within the home and outside of the home, so being aware of that. The other is if they do have access to a cell phone, there's a GPS and a tracking system where sometimes the client, her movement is going to be tracked through her phone, and her male partner may be aware of that and tracking that. And oftentimes we don't call it abuse, we call it family difficulties in order to make her feel more comfortable, and recognizing that's how she might perceive it, using her own words, because in some cultures they don't have the word for abuse, and so therefore you're going to have to work with her to identify how it is and what language that she uses in order to make her feel confident and comfortable. So don't forget, if the client is coming to your program, to turn off that GPS, but if she turns off that GPS on her phone, it can also put her at risk.
And we talked about this in the previous webinar, but I want to address a question you might have or a pressure you might feel when you're staying connected to a client who's living with abuse. You may feel like, why doesn't she leave right now? And feel tempted to maybe pressure her to leave and grow impatient. You're seeing someone who's living with abuse and you think she should leave. The number one principle that we want everyone to be aware of when you're working with people living with abuse, women living with abuse, is do not push. This can do far more harm than good. It can take time for survivors to know what they want to do next, and it is essential that support must be at a time and a pace that is acceptable to the woman, to the survivor. And one thing about abuse that we know is that it's about power and control. So she already has someone in her life who's controlling her and pressuring her and pushing her around. So the last thing we want to do is treat her the same way when she comes and looks for support. So this is a very important principle. And then we're almost done with the slides, but I just want to go through some do's and don'ts that relate to how you can share resources and offer support to the client who's disclosed. So what you do want to do is share resources, so the Assaulted Women's Helpline, community legal services, things like that. So you want to share resources, and you can say, here's a resource I want to share with you. I can support you in accessing it. Let me know if you have any questions about it. So you can share resources in that way. What you don't want to do is force her to use them. So you don't want to say something like, here's a resource and you need to use it right now. This is very serious, so you don't have a choice. You don't want to put that pressure. So do you see the difference there? One is offering information and giving her the choice about whether she wants to use it, and the second one is forcing. Similarly, you do want to share information. You can share information about abuse and abusive relationships and signs of high risk, and let her know about what options are available to her. For example, shelters, housing that she could access. Again, you don't want to pressure her and tell her that she needs to use the resources right now and make her feel guilty if she doesn't want to. And then again, a final piece is you do want to respect if she wants to stay in the relationship. Back to that piece about do not push. Staying in the relationship may be the safest option for her until she can figure out another plan. It takes time and planning for a woman to come to grips with the problem and figure out what to do or where to go. You do not want to try to force her to leave the relationship, especially since leaving an abusive relationship can be a very dangerous time, and it is up to the survivor if and when she wants to leave. And we're going to talk in very soon about safety planning. Is there anything for this? Okay. And I just want to talk about assessing the risk. So if you're in communication with someone living with abuse, you may be concerned about what her level of risk is. I want to point out that unless it's part of your job description, you are not required to carry out a comprehensive risk assessment or risk management for someone living with abuse. And in fact, you should not carry out a risk assessment without appropriate training and experience. So we really encourage you to reach out to experts in this area, women's shelters in your area to get support on risk assessment. Call the Assaulted Women's Helpline for their input. And I also wanted to make you aware of this resource, which will be emailed to everyone, which is a free full training on risk assessment from Learning to End Abuse. So that's a self-directed free training that you can use to learn more about risk assessment in that process. So although you aren't responsible for a formal risk assessment, many service providers are responsible for screening and responding to obvious signs of domestic violence. And I'll just put them up quickly here, but I'll let you know that there's actually a whole webinar dedicated to the warning signs of domestic violence and the signs of high risk, and that's going to be emailed to you. So you can refer to that webinar to get into detail about that. And then finally, I wanted to talk about a best practice that is essential for supporting clients living with abuse, and that is building a community network. This is work, supporting women living with abuse is not something we should do in isolation as service providers. It takes a team and a coordinated effort to offer effective support. So it's very important to build relationships with women's shelters, housing workers, legal clinics, interpreter services, police services, and counseling services that are in your area, that you can make those phone calls and work as a team when clients disclose that they're living with abuse. And if you have any, if you aren't sure where to start, a good number to call that we always emphasize is the Assaulted Women's Helpline, because they can let you know what resources there are near you that you can be in touch with. And I do want to make one note about the police. If you are working with police, do ask for an officer who specializes in abuse cases. And remember that information shared with the police may result in charges being laid against the abuser. And also it's important to note that women who don't have status in Canada may fear contacting the police because of their status could become known. Is there anything?
I'd like to add that as part of this community of networking and community of practice, between the women's shelters and the counseling services, there are women's centers in each community that can bridge the gap between those two services. Sometimes counseling services aren't available in that particular client's language, and the local women's centers will certainly have that information available for you, and they can also help you navigate all the other aspects in accessing housing, legal, interpreter, even medical services, because I think that's another important area where we tend to forget, mental health as well as physical health. So those are really critical elements that are also included as part of the network of service delivery. And also the schools, sorry, I forgot, so I'm looking at this again and realizing that there is a partnership that can exist with the schools, particularly if she has young children, and working with the school and identifying and reporting those issues, because they're going to be a part of the support system as well for the family.
The final slide we have here is just on safety planning. As you'll see when you go through the webinar on the signs of high risk, the time that a woman is planning to leave or actually leaving an abusive relationship is a high risk time for the violence escalating to homicide, femicide. So it's very important that if your client is thinking about leaving or planning to leave, that there's a safety plan in place. And we do want to note that service providers, again, shouldn't make a comprehensive safety plan on their own. Consult a local women's shelter or women's organization or the Assaulted Women's Helpline for assistance with that. But I'm just going to show you a few examples of what goes into safety planning. And this is all taken from a resource that Fatima actually is involved in developing called Recognizing and Responding to Intimate Partner Violence Resource Guide for Refugee Resettlement Assistance Programs in Ontario. And that guide will be emailed to everyone who's participated in this webinar. So in safety planning, there are actually 4 stages of safety planning to be aware of. And in the stages I show you, I'm just going through a few of the points under each stage. There is actually a lot more to each stage, which is available in the full guide. So you want safety planning for while she's living with the abuser, in which case you want to ask her to plan where to go in an emergency, teach her and her children how to get help. You may want to suggest she hides her keys, cell phone, and some money near her escape route. And you also might want to explain that a local shelter or police will be able to equip her with a panic button or cell phone. So that's safety planning while she's still living with the abuser. There's safety planning for when she's planning to leave the abuser. And this can look like especially advising her to gather important documents, financial papers, passports, health cards, etc. There's safety planning for while she's actually leaving the abuser, in which case she can request a police escort to leave safely if she wants. You may want to tell her that a women's shelter may be safer as a temporary spot than going to a place that her partner knows, such as a friend's house. Women's shelters have much more security in place, and you would want to suggest that strongly that she doesn't tell her partner she's leaving. And then there's also safety planning for after leaving the abuser. So in that case, you would want to suggest that she changes her telephone number, gets caller ID, makes sure that her children's school and daycare is aware of the situation, advise her to carry a photo of her abuser and her children at all times. And again, these are just a few points for each stage. There's a much more comprehensive list in the resource guide. But I just wanted you to see those 4 stages. Is there anything to add to that?
I think you can't underestimate the danger that the female woman or the woman is in given the circumstances, and we've heard many reports that's when the violence does escalate, when the abuser does know. And it's important to tell the woman, even when she's living with the abuser, never to let him know that she plans on leaving, even if situation is very critical. The first thing she needs to do is know how to call 911 or run to a neighbor or scream and make sure the neighbors can hear her. It's also critical to inform her again. Some people do not accept blocked phone calls. I know our phone number at my office is blocked, and so some clients, we can't call them because that our blocked phone number will not be accepted. So if we release that, it's putting her at greater risk. It's also putting my organization at risk. And so we often try to find ways to call her through other means and making sure we can connect with her. And we'll talk about that through the question period. But again, safety planning involves all stages, even after. The abuse doesn't end just because she's left. She's still at great risk, regardless. If the abuser knows where her children are going to school and they continue to go there, so you're going to have to analyze all situations and making sure that you understand what the risks are within those situations. And that's why it's important to connect with women's shelter, women's services, or the Assaulted Women's Helpline, because they will help you to navigate all of that. And they could, you're the broker to get them to those services to make sure that we can ensure that your client and her children's safety.
So we did want to leave the remainder of the time open for your questions for us. So as Sarah mentioned at the beginning, you can ask questions verbally using the hand signal key, or you can type in your questions. So let's see what we have. Okay, how do we... Okay.
I am your fan. Oh my gosh.
Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. How does she deal with financial dependency on the abuser?
Oh, well, that is perhaps one of the primary reasons why women don't leave the abusive relationship, because they know that they cannot support themselves financially. So part of the planning will involve contacting employment social services and getting her on assistance, finding out ways and means to do that. There might involve a sponsorship breakdown, and you're going to have to address that. And it probably might be best to do that while she's in transition, either at a shelter or staying at a safe place. I can't emphasize enough, safe place is really critical to this whole process. And they will handle all of that, and transitioning from being dependent on the spouse to actually receiving some financial assistance on her own. And once women realize that that might be available to them, that helps them to take another step towards making the decision to leave. And financial support is absolutely critical, because she'll have to find her own place to rent, to pay for her children's needs, to buy food, all of that. So, but that can happen during the transition. It doesn't happen automatically, because if there is a sponsorship breakdown, then that'll be an issue that can be addressed within the sector, within the movement.
And I'm just wondering, in terms of getting her own bank account, is that something that you think that she should wait till she's
You can do that in transitioning. I think it's important for her to establish, even if she puts in $10, let's say, or even $5, and talk to the bank, because as you know, some banks will charge a fee if there's no money being deposited. And there's a way to get around that. The organization, we have a relationship with our financial institution, and we try to set up accounts for some of our women, some of our seniors, where they can look at that. And yes, that is important. But when she's on social assistance, let's say they're transitioning from leaving the home into a shelter, and she's receiving social assistance, there are checks mailed to her, so she'll be able to do that, and then the bank account can be established with that check. So there are ways for that to happen. But it is good to do that, but it's also, again, the fear is that if they're sending statements to you at home, or they're sending statements to her in the email, that's a problem. We receive clients' email and clients' mail at my organization, so there are ways to get around that.
So that the abuser doesn't know that
That's
she's
correct.
opened this bank account.
That's correct.
Right. Okay. Next question is, if the woman's immigration status is directly linked to her husband's status and she is unlikely to take action but has reached out to share her story with me, based on the slides, would the best advice be to offer verbal support and direct her to local community networks?
Yes and yes. Status is the biggest fear for women in leaving an abusive relationship. They fear that they will lose their status in Canada. In fact, they will not. Just recently, the Liberal government announced doing away with the 2-year residency requirement, and so women will no longer be held captive for 2 years until they obtain permanent residency here in Canada. So absolutely. It's important to let women know that she will not be deported because of the violence, but it's important to document the incidents of violence in order to make the case more credible, obviously, and that has to be, the first and foremost priority for her and her safety, but documentation of incidences are also really important to this process. And again, we just have to be very clear. Very, very, very few women that I'm aware of were deported because they declared that they are victims of abuse. There are circumstances where there were cases, which is not to say that there aren't, but they've been addressed on the humanitarian and compassionate grounds. But again, the 2-year residency requirement has now been eliminated, so I think there's that. Even under that requirement, the previous government also made exceptions for women who are experiencing domestic violence. So we have to be very careful about that. But again, ensuring that she has access to those documents is going to be critical, because regardless if she's sponsored or not sponsored, we need to know what her status in Canada is, and we need to be sure that we can relay that appropriately when we're dealing with immigration.
Mm-hmm. And one resource to be aware of is anyone in Ontario living with domestic violence, regardless of what their immigration status is, can get 2 hours of legal advice from Legal Aid Ontario. So we'll send out that phone number and website, and you can, and there are interpreters available for that resource as well. So she would be able to access that.
That's correct. And Legal Aid Ontario has made available to certain legal clinics across the province domestic support. We don't call it domestic violence, but domestic support for women who are experiencing family issues and family breakdown, which includes intimate partner violence.
Okay. How about this? Next question I was thinking of going with is, what would the best practice be in the case that the client is followed by her abuser to the Center for Counseling and insists on being present in the session?
You know, I think there are two ways to look at this, and I think I've had all situations when the husband is not aware that she's disclosed abuse, and when she is aware that she has disclosed abuse. What we've done in the past is try to separate. You know, we gain the trust of both the man and the woman in those circumstances, and invite. You know, we have sessions with the men, and we invite sessions with the women separately. So we try to organize activities that would break out the groups. We often do a lot of, for example, we talk about family life in Canada, we talk about parenting, and so sometimes we offer opportunities where the women would come where their partners might not be present with them. And it is a challenge. It's not cut and dry, and I think you're going to have to find times and places and where you can talk with her alone and individually, and ensuring that the husband is not becoming concerned about what she's talking to the worker about. And in some cases what we do is, if the husband is working and the woman is attending a program, we can talk to her while the program is in session, so the husband is not aware of that. We've had circumstances where the husband has followed the wife to us after she's disclosed. We do have safety procedures in place from our organizations. We have CCTV cameras all over all our offices. We do have procedures in place for my staff in terms of safety for the client, as also safety for the staff. So there are ways to do that. But I think that the best way is to try to get the woman into programs where she's going to be participating in things like English language programs, parenting classes, so that the partner feels that she's not talking to someone individually, but that can happen while the programs are in session.
Next question is, what happens in cases where there are children involved? Some fear leaving with children and being accused of abduction or kidnapping, or leaving without children and being accused of abandonment and then losing custody in family court because of either of these steps. How can she get around that for her own safety and the safety of her children?
First of all, when there's a domestic violence, it's just not an abduction. This is a safety issue, and when you're in a shelter, they're going to handle it in that way, and you're obviously going to have to deal with gaining custody and addressing custody of the children. If there are no prior custody orders in place, then it's not abduction. Where there is, there will be a challenge with regards to that, and that's why the legal clinic is really important, to make sure you get the right information to the client and making sure that she understands what the circumstances is. Yes, if the woman does leave without the children, it can be perceived as abandonment. In Canada, the laws are very different, and so we have to be aware of that. In some cultures, women are not allowed to keep their children, and so we talk to them about the laws here in Canada, and it will be perceived as abandonment. So we often advise women to leave with their children if there are no prior custody orders in place, or other issues related to custody of the children. So in those circumstances where none exists, then we would absolutely instruct the women to leave with their children.
And is it preferable to leave with their children and go to a shelter? Does that help with the argument that?
Absolutely. Or you can report. You have a report, and we've had letters documenting the abuse internally if we haven't gone to the police, or if they've gone to the police and reported, which not necessarily resulted in a charge, but obviously resulted in a report being made. So there are those circumstances where we keep that information, and it does help going to a shelter. But if you can't find a shelter space, then you're going to have to figure out a different way to approach that. But documentation is always the best method to have that in place.
And okay, next question is, if the abuser hides her documents, like her passport or birth certificate, how can we help her then?
That's a very challenging question, and I think the way we've gotten around that is by for example, signing up for language classes, link classes. We often work with the partner and letting her know that we need those documents in order for her to be registered, so you have a photocopy of that on hand. We often say, for example, if they're in our programs, we need her OHIP, so something happened to her, she becomes falls ill. So we need to contact someone, we need to have that available just in case the emergency crew, the EMS crew arrives. So you find creative ways to ensure accessing those documents, but you know what? Sometimes it just isn't going to happen. And then that's maybe where the police come in as an escorted support, where they're going to demand those documents. And so there are ways for that to happen after she's left or while she's leaving with the police on site. I've been in situations where we thought it was a safe time to leave, and lo and behold, the partner walks through the door. You know, the male partner walks through the door while we're actually helping the woman with her bags and her kids out the door. And that's where we called 911. They were informed that we were going to the home, so they were well aware that if we called, there was a critical incident that they needed to address. They arrived very quickly, and that's when we were able to get all her documents properly secured, and she was escorted out with us and the police.
Okay. Why advise her to carry a photo of her abuser and her children with her at all times?
Well, the police need to have a good description if something were to happen. The school needs to have a description of her partner and have that on file if the school has been alerted that this is a situation. Your agency staff need to be aware that that might be a critical issue, because they could walk in being very, very angry, and you know how to handle them as soon as they walk in the door. So it's really about ensuring safety and making sure that you can identify the individual as quickly as possible and as best as possible.
So the next question is, we have seen some situations where the survivor and abuser get back together after a period of separation. What is our role, especially when our risk management assessment indicates otherwise? We have seen some situations where the survivor and the abuser... Oh, that's the same question. Okay. Yeah. So,
you know, it's not a cut and dry situation. Unfortunately, life is complicated. You know, relationships are complicated, and for many reasons, women will go back to their partners. One being, again, financial support. If they're not able to live on their own, they don't have that. Or the male abuser has more resources. He probably is working. He has more access to resources. Court, our judicial system, our legal system makes it a lot more difficult for women to get the support that they need. You know, certainly now with Ontario Legal Aid making some supports available, it might be a little bit easier not being able to find work. So there are many, many, many reasons why women will go back to a relationship, and there's no one right or wrong answer, in spite of the fact I can tell you about a case that we had a woman 20 years ago who finally came to us and said, she's done, she's ready, and she's now ready to press charges. One woman 10 years ago. So it really is understanding her circumstances and her relationship with the abuser. And sometimes it's within our own community and our own cultures, understanding the fact that they make it harder for her to leave. Oh, come on, he can't be that bad, or it can't be that bad. You must have done something wrong. Oh, come on. It's better for the kids even if they stay in their relationship. There are a lot of pressures that women will face because of that. I know you've talked about that in the last session. It's not cut and dry, and I think, you know, it's ultimately her decision. Unless you recognize that she's going to kill herself, then obviously you call 911. If the children are being abused, then again you call 911, and you are called the Children's Aid Society. So there are exceptional circumstances where you're going to say that that can't apply.
And it's about going back to that same principle of don't push, you know. So if she does go back to the relationship, we don't judge that, we don't pressure her, we don't shame her for that. And just go back to the position of, here are some resources if you need them. I think the statistic from Interval House actually, in fact, is that it takes an average of 5 attempts to leave before a woman permanently leaves an abusive partner. And like Fatima was saying, if she does leave for a period of time, there can be an enormous amount of pressure put on her to return. The community could get involved and say that he's devastated, he's apologized. And then again, like Fatima was saying, financial pressures could mount. There could be an ongoing custody issue that, you know, she feels that it's just easier to return. So there's so much pressure. So we don't want to judge her if she goes back.
Absolutely not. I mean, social media also plays an important role in this. We've had our clients have her, he's reported this to her family back home, and they're pressuring her, and they're posting messages on Facebook, on social media, pressuring the woman to go back into the relationship and talking about the fact that, oh my goodness, now we're not going to be able to sponsor anybody else and you're ruined it for our families, all kinds of pressures. You recognize the role that social media is going to play in making the woman feel uncomfortable, and also how that's going to, her kids are going to access that information on social media, because the kids may want the mom and the dad to be together in spite of the situation. So understanding all of that is really, really very difficult. There's no one way or no one right answer with regards to this, but understanding that that's going to, social media will play a role in this, and making sure that she feels isolated or shamed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you want to stay connected to her again, because you wouldn't want her to feel like, oh, well, they spent all this effort helping me leave, and so now I don't want to go back and talk to them because, now I'm back with him. You definitely don't want to give that impression, because then that cuts off your connection to her. So the next question is, what are the risks of involving CAS for the abused woman? Is that right, that each time police are called, they have to notify CAS if kids are involved?
The straight answer is probably yes. Mm-hmm. If the police do suspect that the abuse is I guess risky, or if the children are involved, and if they see that the children are crying, but not all cases will CAS remove the child from the custody of the mother or the father. They might find ways to work and support the woman. I think we have to look at CAS as also as a supporter in providing supports to the woman or to the family, and not necessarily the big bad organization removing children from that. We also have to recognize that abuse does affect children, and we have to be concerned about their safety as well, and also their emotional well-being. So it's not always cut and dry, but I think if the police do suspect that there might be a risk for the children, a higher risk than normal, then they will be called, mm-hmm. and they will be addressed.
Okay. Time for another question. Is there anyone that stands out? This one. When women who immigrate to Canada are joined by their partners and there is a history of violence, how does one support a woman when she doesn't acknowledge current abuse?
I think it's what was presented in the slides, is just using her own language, acknowledging her situation. In some cultures, women don't have the rights and freedoms that we might necessarily enjoy here in Canada. So understanding, that context. It's also important to, sometimes say, well, he never hits me, and therefore I'm not abused. But emotionally, financially, religious abuse will take place. And I think, understanding what that really is, talking about the different forms of abuse, putting her down, calling her names, threatening to harm her family or the children or their pets or other family members back home. All kinds of threats and intimidation are all part of abuse, and understanding that. And it's interesting how women's perspective will change once they know that. We've dealt with women, for example, one woman said, although the physical abuse ended, her emotional torture was perhaps the hardest element and a hardest component for her to overcome. The emotional trauma that she suffered while she was living in that abusive relationship. And interestingly, in the United States, they did a study in saying that more women suffer from head injuries than male athletes. You talk about the number of times that women have been hit on the head by their male partners, and so understanding all of that and saying, oh, I didn't cook the dinner properly, or I was late, or the children were too noisy. They find excuses because they don't understand what violence is, and helping them through that is really the first step along the process.
So another question about financial issues. What is the best financial advice for the victim who is leaving but has a joint bank account with the abuser? Can she withdraw a portion of the money in this account before leaving? Yes,
we do advise that. We try to make arrangements with the financial institution. Things can be done electronically. She doesn't have to show up on site. And so sometimes getting that bank access card is going to be really important in helping her to navigate that and helping for that transition. And if she feels that that's going to be too high of a risk, let it go. $200 isn't worth her life, isn't worth her being beaten again or putting her at higher risk. And there might be opportunities later on down the road to address that. I mean, there are bigger issues with regards to joint property. The other issue is also if her name is on the lease, what her liability is. It could be both ways. We've had situations where the man refuses to acknowledge the woman on the lease if they're renting an apartment or renting a space, or other times they put her name on the lease and therefore something happens, she's completely liable for that. So there's those financial implications that also have to be considered as part of this. But if she can find ways to open up her own bank account, and if not, we can make, the bank card can certainly help to make the transfer. But again, always assess the risk that that's going to bring on. I know for most women, they don't really care about that. They just want to get out. If we're talking about, women making the decision, I had a woman who was almost 74 or 75 come to our agency, and she says, I've lived with this abuse all my life. My children are grown. They're now living their own lives. Now it's my turn. And she walked away from everything. She walked away from a joint ownership of the home. She walked away from bank accounts, and we helped her to apply for a Canada pension. And that's the life that she wanted to live. Even though we knew she had rights to access to the family home, she chose not to do that.
Okay, so take 2 more questions about kids, about children, and then wrap it up from there. First question is about in a shelter. If a mother has children that are at a teen age, what will a women's shelter offer to her and to the kids? Because I know there are those.
Yes, every shelter is different, and you're going to have to figure that out. Some shelters don't like teen boys because of the risk that they may pose, and that's a negotiation process you're going to have with each shelter. I can't speak for all shelters across Ontario, so I really don't know. But there are also other ways to transition that and figuring out how to work with teenage boys in particular, and how to address that. I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add to that, Sidrah.
Yeah, I know that can be a barrier for women, especially I think sometimes the age cutoff is 12, and if they have a kid who's 13, they're not sure what to do about that. And yeah, negotiation is big, and yeah. It
is. I think that's the only way you're going to identify it. I think you also have to identify the risk for the woman. How much of a risk is she in, and if it's a high risk, and then obviously we're going to, that's where the negotiation strategies comes in with the shelter, or finding other ways and helping her to transition through that. Surprisingly, we've had some of the faith groups we work with, and they offer actually a couple of days, even maybe 3 or 4 days of hotel stay for the woman because of the situation with an older boy, and that way we can work that out and try to find emergency shelter, not necessarily or emergency housing in some situations like that. Yes.
And then finally, sometimes a woman can feel extremely anxious after being left to care for her kids alone. Mm-hmm. That is something that happens to her, and she's worried that something will happen to her and she will not be able to pick up her kids from school. Where are they taken? Back to the abuser.
Okay. Well, I think if you're going to be moving the family, you're going to be moving the kids away from the school, the home school. Unfortunately, that's going to be the case in order to ensure safety. I mean, nothing worse than sending the kids back to school knowing that their father is going to show up either in the morning or the afternoon. And so most shelters will work something out with a school in their communities to register the kids where they're not aware of. I've had a woman come to us from Scarborough, almost on the edge of Scarborough. Agincourt actually come to a Rexdale because that was how far she needed to get away from the abuse. I've seen women who left their countries come to Canada in order to get away from the abuse. So you have to think about it in those terms. And so the kids are probably not going to go back to the schools that they were frequenting before in order to ensure their safety and the safety of their mother. And so they're going to have to go to the schools. Shelters certainly do have a system in place to support the woman. And it's important that she, if you move her, let's say you're in Scarborough and you move her to Mississauga, that your job is also to ensure that she finds social support systems in Mississauga to help her to deal with her children and her family while she is there, maintaining that relationship between the two organizations. So it's going to be critical that she receives that support in the community she finds herself in at the moment.
And this looks like a follow-up to the previous question. If women have young children and they give up their financial rights and just focus on leaving, will this be a risk to their custody?
Well, yeah, again, if they don't leave with the children, yes. I mean, there will be a risk. You're going to have to explain to the courts, and it's going to be a much more complicated process to explain that to the courts. It's not. I have to say, it's not. It hasn't happened that a woman who has left her children behind will not gain access, but again, it might be more complex and more difficult. And then if she leaves, maybe the abuser might harm the children. So you're going to have to be concerned about that as well.
And if the mother gives up her financial rights, will that risk custody?
I don't know how you mean by giving up her financial rights. How is she going to support herself when she leaves? I guess you're looking about spousal support. That's a different situation. So if I'm interpreting financial rights as spousal support once the relationship has ended. It doesn't matter. I think although social services might insist that the father provide spousal support. It may not be her decision, but it may be up to social services for that determination. So I think you have to look at that and make that assessment. And if the children are over 18, that's a different story. But when they're younger children, it might not be this case. And so working with the family court system here in Ontario and identifying payments in there for family support payments for the children are going to be dictated through the system. And if she doesn't want that, if they're older, then that's a different story. But when they're younger, might not be an option or consideration that she wants. She might not want spousal support for herself, but it's really for the kids.
Yeah. Okay.
I think my advice is, if you're not sure, you're uncertain and you're not sure how to handle the situation, always consult. That's, let your client know that. Just say, you know what, I want to give you the best advice I can give you, so therefore I'm going to talk to someone. I'm not going to disclose them, not to disclose any information that you do not want me to disclose. And oftentimes when we're working with clients, when we're working with multiple service organizations, there's a case management approach in addressing the violence and overcoming the violence. It's important that we obtain consent from the client, and that's written consent. So as an organization, in order to protect yourself and also your organization, you're going to have to ensure that you have that written consent from that client. And if there are 6 agencies involved, it's 6 different consent forms. It's not one blanket form that applies to every organization. So you're going to have to be really very clear when you're dealing with the different social services that are out there, that you have the appropriate approach and consent on the client with that, and document it, because some clients will say, but I listened to you and you told me to do this. And it's not about you telling her, it's about giving her those options, identifying what are the risks and what are the benefits within those options, and then making sure you document that and saying, here's what I understand, this is what we agreed on, are you in agreement with that? Yes. And so sometimes it does involve that kind of a contractual relationship with the woman, because as we know, sometimes women will go back and they may come back and say to you, I tried it and you made me do that and it didn't work. So be very, very clear about what it is that the client understands when they leave your office. And also think about your own safety, which is really critical to this element. Can't stress enough, blocked phone calls. If you give your client the card, I've had situations where the client has left the card on the table, your business card. So being aware that shouldn't be the case. I've had situations where one woman was actually locked in the home. The doors were always locked, the windows were locked. She was unable to open them. She finally connected with a friend of the spouse and said, and quickly explained her situation. He contacted one of my board members. My board members contacted me. We said, get her a cell phone, get her a means to communicate. And finding out, she didn't even know she had any permanent status in Canada, but she was seeing a doctor. So the doctor would know she had an OHIP. She had an OHIP card, therefore she had some sort of legal status in Canada. So there are so many different ways of how you're going to have to assess the situation and circumstances that the woman is facing, and it's not always cut and dry. Not every case is going to be the same, and you're going to find anomalies and challenges with each of those cases. But again, also identifying your own safety and identifying the safety of your staff and the organization is also critical, because there are men out there who are how do I say, who are going to be bigger risks than just for the woman and her family.
Mhm.
And knowing that also, you need to ask those questions. You know, does he carry a weapon? Does he use firearms? All those things are really important to her, you know, to her assessment and for your own assessment. And if you do not feel confident or comfortable doing that, then work with other organizations that know how to deal with that. That's the best advice I can give. And you know, you are that broker, you are that connector for the woman to other services, expertise and services that are out there.
You mentioned those contracts. Do you want to tell folks about the vowelearning.com, what's
Sure.
coming up there?
Thank you for reminding me about that. We have been working with OCASI and the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. We've developed a resource guide and a protocol for organizations and an online training tool for agencies or for staff working with refugees and refugee reception centers. And it's on, the website is www.vawelearning, all one word, .com. And you can access the resource guide there and the information that's going to be there. We're going to be putting the protocol up very shortly, and some other materials are going to be developed coming up within by the end of July. So, but again, I think what Sidrah has said is really the Assaulted Women's Helpline is by far the best resource for any information across all of Ontario. And you know, we've had women move to other provinces, so don't exclude that as part of the process. If they have other friends or family members that they feel confident that will support them in other parts of the city or other parts of the region or out of the province, don't overlook that.
Also, that piece about safety is so important, and also self-care. And I wonder, Sarah, if you wanted to mention the self-care webinar that's coming up.
Yes, so we have another best practice webinar coming up on self-care. I will include the link in a follow-up email where you can register. It has a date and a time as well. And on the same page there will be the recording of today's webinar. Someone had asked if the questions and answers are recorded as well. Yes, so it's all part of the same recording. The resources that were mentioned today will be in that follow-up email as well.
And it's important to, you know, when you're with someone and they're revealing horrific situations, that to recognize your own stress. I know post-traumatic stress is the client's going to face that, you're going to face that. What we normally use is help our staff to debrief with other workers in the organization or their supervisor, using sounding boards, and just acknowledging that it was a very difficult situation for you to be involved in. And so yes, absolutely take that time. And do not get burnt out by the sheer volume of issues or the complexity of the issues, and don't let that make it harder for you to function in the workplace.
I just wanted to share some resources that we're developing with the campaign. We're going to be, so we have these posters that you can order to put up in your office just to create give the message that this is a place where you can disclose about abuse and people are here to help. There are people here to listen, to refer, to be there for you. So these are some posters that will be available to OCASI member agencies in the next month or so, as well as a card series where on the inside of the card there'll be information about the abuse, and on the front of the card there will be two scenarios. One will be healthy, and one will be an abusive situation, just to get people to think about these different nuances of, you know, it isn't just about physical abuse, it's about financial abuse, which is what is shown here in this postcard, and also sexual violence can happen in domestic abuse as well. So this postcard series will also be translated into 8 different languages and hopefully more. So that's another thing to look out for. And so I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today, especially Fatima for this wealth of knowledge. That was very, very informative. Thank you so much. And if folks, so the website Fatima mentioned to follow her work is www.vawelearning.com. So that's to look out for all the resources she's involved in developing in this area. Also, this is our campaign Facebook page and Twitter if you're interested in following that.
Yes.
And,
I think OCASI has done fantastic work in this. We have to give them a big round of applause, which I'll do for all of you online. And, you know, don't forget that the Ontario Women's Director, which is now the Ministry of Status of Women, also has the Neighbours, Friends and Families, and you see that logo on the bottom with all, you know, the three arms up and support. I think that's some really important resource tools there. OCASI's online training tools. So there are lots of opportunities to engage in self-learning and improving our skills and our capacity to address women who are experiencing violence in our sector. So yes.
Thank you all so much, and have a great afternoon. You'll be receiving a follow-up email in 2 days from now with the links that we mentioned today.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the support. Thank you.